Welcome to the Employment, Law, and HR Podcast with your host, Alison Colley.
Hello and welcome to this episode 219 of the Employment Law and HR Podcast. I'm your host, Alison Colley. I'm an employment law specialist and I run the firm Real Employment Law Advice, where together with my colleagues we provide advice and assistance to both employers and employees on all aspects of employment law. Our flagship service is our HR Harbour membership, which is a service that we offer to employers to provide you with ongoing support in relation to HR and employment law. If you think of us as being your HR outsourced resource, then you can get all levels of support from just access to telephone advice through to us coming into your business and undertaking meetings and HR functions for you. If you'd like to know more about the service and how we can help you, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. My email is alison@realemploymentlawsadvice.co.uk. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by Michelle Gyimah. Michelle has been a contact of mine on LinkedIn for a number of years, and she always posts great content and a regular newsletter about equality and the pay gap. Michelle is a pay gaps expert who has first-hand experience of what the pay gap feels like. She spent 10 years working at the Equality and Human Rights Commission and provides lots of useful information in relation to the pay gap and how employers and organisations can work to close their pay gap. Michelle is also the host of the podcast Beyond the Pay Gap Figure, which I'll link to in the show notes. So without further ado, I'm going to get into this week's featured content. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Michelle today. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast, Michelle.
Thank you for having me.
Do you want to tell the audience a bit about yourself and how you started your business and got into the world of equal pay?
Yeah, well, I always start the story with saying that it's by accident because I don't think many people think to themselves, when I grow up, I want to be a pay gaps consultant. So I started my kind of real professional life working at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and the remit for them is to provide advice for employers on how to understand the Equality Act that was introduced in 2010, how to make sense of it in terms of, running their businesses, whether they were businesses or education organisations, etc. And so I started life working on the helpline. So I was advising schools and colleges and universities. And then I decided to go for a promotion. And the way that it worked in the organisation is that you did an interview and based on your skills, and then you were assigned like a theme, as it were. So that was how I ended up becoming an equal pay policy manager. And interestingly enough, I knew nothing about equal pay. I'd never even heard of it. So I got this job, and then I basically had to learn on the job, as it were. So the work that I did was advising employers on what equal pay was and how to navigate it and what they should be doing as employers and business owners. And then after a while, I decided that actually I wanted to do it freelance. Obviously, this was once I understood what I was doing, because I wanted to be much more hands-on. I wanted to be involved actually with the businesses, trying to kind of problem solve the challenges that they had and help them find solutions around how to ensure that they provided equal pay and how to close their gender and ethnicity pay gap. So that was when I set up my business, which I set up when I was actually coming to the end of my first round of maternity leave. And that was 9 years ago, because my eldest is now 10. So the work that I do is around supporting employers with their gender pay gap reporting and supporting them with creating action plans that genuinely work for them, because I think there's still quite a lot of mystery around the gender pay gap. There's still quite a bit of, misconceptions and miseducation. So my work is around demystifying what the pay gap is and then helping employers to, pull those strategies and plans together that actually make sense for their business, as opposed to kind of chasing the idea of just being able to reduce their figure because, that makes them look good. Yeah. So that's what I do in a nutshell.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So I think what we'll do is, if we start really with the basics, you talked there about gender pay gap reporting, and there may be many people listening to the podcast who don't understand what that is or haven't any idea. So could you just explain what the obligations are and who it applies to?
Yeah, so gender pay gap reporting is within the Equality Act. And so what that means is that for businesses that have 250 employees or more, they have to report publicly on what their gender pay gap figure is. And, the government has set out, specific measurements that they have to take. So for those of you that remember, your kind of maths, you have to do the median and you have to do the mean, which is basically the average earnings between men and women within the organisation. And what happens is that information is put onto a public government portal. So anybody can go and access that portal and see that information. And the information that's on there is held for 3 years. So if you have already reported for the last 2 years, the last year, or 3 years, that information is going to be on the portal so people can go and see what improvements, if any improvements, you've made. And then what you should do is also have that information on your website as well so that people can go and find it. The legislation doesn't say that you have to provide an action plan for those of us that are in the UK, but it is advisable to, because the thing about numbers is that it can mean nothing to people. It can be very confusing. And so having an action plan and a narrative is your opportunity to essentially explain some of the context as to why you have the pay gap and explain what you're going to do about it next. And so the deadline is the same time every year. So for public sector, it's the 31st of March. And for private sector, it's usually any time between the 4th and 6th of April.
And you have to have 250 employees at that point. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, that's the threshold. However, having said that, there are some companies that have less that will voluntarily report anyway, because they obviously see the value in doing this work and obviously, being very public and visible.
And so in relation to the requirements to report your gender pay gap, if a company fails to do that, what are the consequences for them?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because technically the Equality and Human Rights Commission kind of own ownership over managing what happens. And so at the moment, my understanding is that they have the ability to kind of name and shame organisations that don't report. So I think if you go onto their website, they will have a list of all the companies that haven't reported on their pay gap. Another thing that they also do is they can write to organisations if they think that the data that they've put through doesn't make statistical sense. And there have been times where they've had to write to some companies, some well-known UK companies, several times, saying to them, you need to resubmit this data because what you've produced is factually impossible. It just doesn't make sense. But having said that, I was actually having a conversation with a colleague of mine, and there is potential talk around the Equality and Human Rights Commission having more powers in terms of kind of sanctions, I guess, things that they could do to organisations that don't report on this. But however, at this stage, nothing has been confirmed, but I think conversations are being had as to how to ensure that all companies that come under that remit do actually report at all, as well as on time.
So really the consequences about business reputation, isn't it? And reputation amongst your consumers, contracts and employees, rather than it being a sort of financial sanction for failure.
Yeah. And, and I guess it's like with everything, organisations have to weigh up as to whether they think that is enough of a consequence. But I mean, we live in a time where, we can access information instantly, but it also means that we can make perceptions about companies instantly as well. So you have to weigh up, is it worth not reporting on this or reporting it late? is that genuinely worth it to save yourself some time because you're busy? And I think for a lot of organizations, the answer is no, because, I know increasingly that people are very, very interested in companies' pay gap reports. And I also know anecdotally that it's coming up during interviews, at the end when they say, have you got any questions? People are doing their research about companies, and one of the questions that comes up quite a lot is the commitment to DEI, and obviously pay gaps is within that remit. So even though it might seem like brand reputation, I'm sure we can ride it out, for me it doesn't feel like a risk that's worth taking, because you don't actually know how that's going to play out essentially.
And then, so moving on in relation to equal pay, so we've talked about the requirements to report, but of course, individuals or collective groups of employees can bring claims in relation to equal pay, can't they? And that's not just exclusively to larger employers, that could be more employers as well. So do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so equal pay is different, and I think there is sometimes some confusion between equal pay and the gender pay gap. So when we talk about equal pay, we're talking about, is pay fair and equal between two comparators? And so when we talk about comparators, for equal pay, we could be talking about a man and a woman. We could talk about, it could be along the lines of race, it could be along the lines of disability. And it doesn't have to be just one person. You can have, a cohort of people who are comparing themselves to another cohort of people. And so, the kind of classic examples, I think, with Asda and, Birmingham City Council, obviously that's made the headlines very recently. And the difference with that is that this is enshrined in legislation. So, equal pay is a legal right. It's unlawful to have equal pay. And so that is where the size of the organization doesn't make a difference here. A person or a group of people can bring a claim in tribunal to say that they feel that they are not receiving, equal pay compared to their comparators, and that there is no real objective justification for that difference. And so therefore it can only be because of their gender, or because of their race, or because they have a disability. So that is the main thing. And when it comes to gender pay gap reporting, there are restrictions as to who needs to report, and there isn't really any kind of legal recourse, because it's more about progression and how do you see representation within an organisation. But with equal pay, there is that kind of legal backup.
Yeah, so that's quite a critical difference, isn't it? An individual can bring an equal pay claim based on their protected characteristic, and which could be any of the protected characteristics, not just gender, whereas currently the requirements to report are only in relation to gender. And so, obviously we talked a bit about the legal risks of getting things wrong, the reputational risks, but there must be a wider benefits for the organisation for approaching equal pay in a purposeful way. So what are the kind of benefits that your clients see from taking this action and doing this work?
Well, it's in and of itself, it's a great attraction and retention tool, because when, people feel valued and they feel that they are being paid fairly, and they feel that the opportunity to progress in their career is much more equitable, they're much more likely to stay with you, much more likely to be productive. And something that I talk to clients about a lot is that, you have to remember that your employees they're your ambassadors. So whether you kind of give them that title or not, the fact that they work for you, they represent your organization. So what you need to be thinking about is, what would you like them to be saying about you when you're not in the room? And so if you are an employer that doesn't take equal pay, doesn't take, closing pay gaps seriously, doesn't have, pay transparency, all those types of things, then what do you think your employees are going to be saying about you if somebody asks, so what's it like to work at such and such? We're all very, amongst our, our friends and peers, we're all quite candid about, what it's like to work somewhere, especially if it's a well-known name. So as an organisation, you do have to be mindful that whilst you may think that there's not that much of a brand reputation risk, or not much of a legal risk or a financial risk, you do have to be careful and think about everything that you choose to do. There is a consequence for that, as well as the things that you choose not to do. So for me, it makes good business sense to make this a priority, alongside all of the kind of business operational things that you do and the financial decisions that you make about your business.
Yeah, that's really interesting you say that, especially at a time where it's very difficult to recruit. There's skills shortage in certain areas. So thinking purposefully about it will obviously impact on your ability to recruit the right people. So I did want to ask a question in relation to pay transparency, and because quite a lot of the time businesses are quite protective about what they pay staff. And, I know we've certainly been asked by people, can we tell our employees not to talk about pay? Obviously, the first question is, well, why would you want to do that? But what's your views on businesses who try to, protect the information around pay?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And it's funny that you use the word protect and that businesses are quite protective around that. And I was like, I've not really thought of it from that perspective, because I'm not sure that employees would see as protection. Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I think what tends to happen is that organizations think that pay transparency means everybody knows everybody's business. And the reality is that pay transparency is a spectrum. So at one end, you have that there is no conversation about pay at all. Nobody knows anything. And then at the other extreme is that everybody in the organization knows everyone's pay. And even, it could even be on the internet. So Buffer is an example of a company that has that complete transparency. But then there are different degrees as well. So I think when approaching this conversation, it's about thinking, well, what would work best for our organization? So are we going to go for that complete transparency, or are we going to go for a smaller level of transparency that gives people some kind of ownership over what's happening over their careers, gives them some insight into how the decision about their pay is being made, and gives them some insight into, okay, well, what is required and what could I gain if I wanted to progress in an organization? I do find it a little bit worrying that the concept of possibly stopping people from having this conversation comes up. And the reality is that it's actually very difficult to do because, again, like I said in the example I gave before, we're all candid about, what it's like to work somewhere. So you can't really stop those conversations. But if you are worried about people talking about that, then I think there are two things. One, you do need to understand your pay philosophy. So you do need to understand how those decisions are being made and to check for any inequalities. And one great starting point is to do an equal pay audit to make sure that there isn't any problems. But the second thing I would say is that if you are going to go for some level of pay transparency, is to provide kind of training and support for line managers on how to hold those conversations about pay, because that will enable you to kind of own the narrative in a much more productive and proactive way. And that will help to alleviate some of the fears that you might have around people having their own conversations, because when people are left to their own devices, that's when Rumourville starts. But if you have processes in place and you have people who have an understanding around how to have those conversations, you're in a much better position where you can actually control that narrative much better and ensure that the narrative sticks more closely to the truth as opposed to kind of being inflated because of that absence of information.
No, that's really helpful. And you talked there about doing an equal pay review. And I'm just thinking from a sort of small to medium-sized business perspective, where they don't have any requirement to actually gather this information. They might be thinking, well, do you know what? It all sounds great and we'd love to do it, but we don't have the time. So what are the kind of quick wins that a business could take to resolve some of these issues if they don't have any kind of pay structure in place?
Well, I think because if we're talking about small businesses, small organizations, it doesn't actually have to be very onerous. I mean, it only becomes onerous if you're a large organization, and the chances are that you've probably got resources, people, software to be able to do that. But for small businesses, I know that the Equality and Human Rights Commission, they have information on their website around how you can conduct a kind of light touch equal pay audit. So that's the first thing. It doesn't have to be something that's onerous. And it doesn't have to be something that you have to do every year, kind of every 3 to 5 years is probably a good gauge. But in terms of wins, I would say, the first benefit is that you are building in that resilience in your business. So there's not going to be any kind of unpleasant surprises further down the line because you've done the work. But also it gives you something to talk about within the organization as well as externally. I mean, you pointed to the fact that it's difficult to recruit people right now, but one of your standout selling points could be that you're an organization that takes this seriously and that you are transparent about your findings. And if you find anything untoward, that you do the things that you need to do to rectify them. So I think the quick wins need to be kind of thought about in terms of, how does this enhance our brand reputation, but also how does this build in that business resilience so that we know that there's not going to be any unexpected surprises. We're not going to be served with, papers because, somebody's found out something because you've done that kind of preemptive work, as it were.
No, that's really helpful, and I'll put some links in the show notes to the resources that you've mentioned there, which would be really helpful. Before we sort of round things off, I just want to touch upon a couple of things. Firstly, why do you think it is that women are often paid less than men for the same role?
I think it's a kind of combination of things. So the first one will be around the issue to do with pay transparency and pay secrecy. We talked about, that kind of protectiveness. If you are kind of coming into an interview or promotion role and there is real secrecy or it's very cloak and dagger as to what's available and what's possible, it's very hard to gauge what you should be asking for. And so women might find themselves in a position that in the absence of having any real data and information, they err on the side of caution in order to kind of ensure that they get the job or ensure that they get the promotion. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there's been lots of kind of articles done around the fact that, women don't negotiate or negotiate less than men and men ask for more, etc. But recently we're seeing actually more research coming out saying that women negotiate and ask for, bigger salaries actually just as much as men. But what happens is that they receive much more pushback than men. So they're offered less or they receive much more pushback in having that conversation. So I do think that there is something around ensuring that, our biases around what we pay people and why we pay them more or less than others needs to be factored into when making these decisions. So I think for me, it will be the issue around pay secrecy and the inherent bias that we see in that kind of recruitment and promotion conversation to the detriment of women.
Yeah, and just picking up on that point, then what's your views on people putting the details of the salary in their job adverts? I remember not too long ago on LinkedIn there was quite a big debate about it and whether it was a good practice to put the salary banding or range in the advert or not.
Well, I guess like everything, it depends on how you do it. So I don't know if you know, but in the United States, quite a lot of states are now implementing pay transparency, and New York, I think, was one of the latest ones. And so there's lots of like cheering, like, yeah, this is great, having that transparency at the point of applying for a job. But then you would see some organizations being quite crafty and having like a really massive range of like, $200,000 or something. And then you kind of think, oh, well, that defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do here. My take on it is that, the more transparency, the better, because at the end of the day, we all work for money. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong in being honest about that. Yes, we value our work, it gives us purpose, etc. But the salary has to be right for us and our circumstances. So it makes sense to be upfront about that. Having said that, if this is what you're going to do, then it also makes sense that you kind of get your house in order behind the scenes. And I think part of the reason why some organisations are so protective is because they know that there are real big discrepancies between what they're offering people that are coming in compared to what people have now. So yes, I would definitely advocate for that, but you do have to do all of that work on the back end to ensure that there is fairness and equity baked into what your salary offers are, but for your existing employees as well, because otherwise it's going to cause problems. And then also you may, exacerbating pay gaps and exacerbating equal pay issues as well.
That's great. Thank you. And then finally, I just want to ask, I saw that you had done an episode of your own podcast about how your social economic status impacts on pay. Now, of course, that wouldn't fall under a protected characteristic, but it's quite an interesting point from, I think, obviously where you've come from and what your, family status is as to your perceptions around money and pay and all that sort of thing. So yeah, what's your views on that, and how can you resolve that sort of issue, which isn't enshrined in law and probably not really thought about too much?
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that, because that of the podcast, that is the most popular episode, which I was really, really surprised with. But it obviously has struck a chord with a lot of people, and I think probably because it's something that doesn't get talked about very often. And like you said, it's not, your social class is not a protected characteristic. And part of the reason why I even recorded that episode is because I wanted to kind of lift the lid on this conversation around pay, but look at it from a much more of a personal position in terms of how we think and feel about money. Because I think my perception is that it's a conversation we don't talk about very often, but it's something that impacts our lives. It impacts our behaviors, the choices that we make with the money that we have, with the jobs that we go for, how we decide to spend our money, etc. And so, in that episode, we explored the fact that, depending on, kind of what background you came from, some of the things that you've learned from your parents around putting your head down, just getting on with your work, not asking for too much. When we soak up those ideas, we then don't put ourselves in the position of feeling that it's okay to ask. And then if you marry that with the fact that, some organizations are being really opaque about their pay kind of systems, they may take advantage of the fact that, oh, well, she didn't ask for more. If she had asked for more, I would have given more. So I do think that is a conversation that is coming down the line. It's probably going to be part of financial wellness in terms of having much more open, healthy conversations around money and addressing, our own inherent biases that we might have, that we've inherited from friends and family, to do with our upbringing, our religion, our class, all of those types of things. And it's something that I feel quite passionate about. And, I've trained to be a financial coach because I think that this is important. And even though people might say, oh, well, it's got nothing to do with work, I think it's one of those things that's it influences how we show up at work. So I think it's going to fast become, another topic of conversation when we talk about pay gaps, pay equity and pay transparency.
Yeah, and certainly in terms of the whole diversity, equality and inclusion piece, it's coming up more and more often. In my profession as a solicitor, we have to report data around our employees. And one of the measures now we have to report is what your parents did. I think it's when you were age 15, what employment they were in and whether you're the first to go to university, all of that sort of thing. So, increasing the diversity within the solicitor's profession, recognising that from certain socioeconomic classes, we're not very well represented. So it's certainly something I think that's coming in. Whether that will be any legislation in relation to that, I doubt it. I think there are already moves to extend the protected characteristics in other ways, aren't there, which have been resisted, such as menopause. So I think it's unlikely, but certainly from getting the best and diverse workforce, getting the best skills and experience as employers, I think you should be thinking about all of these things. So that's really helpful. Thank you. It's been really interesting to talk to you, Michelle, and I find it a very fascinating topic, I have to say, and something that doesn't often come up in our day-to-day kind of working areas. It just occasionally pops in with the odd question about it. So it's really interesting to talk to you from your perspective. If anybody would like to get in touch with you to find out more about what you do or to work with you, how's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, so my favourite place to kind of hang out, as they say, is LinkedIn. So you can look for me under my name, Michelle Gyimah. Alternatively, you can have a look on my website, which is qualitypays.co. And I also have a podcast, which is called Beyond the Pay Gap Figure. So I like to share insights around, all things to do with pay equity, pay transparency. So yeah, I would say that they're the three best places for you to kind of catch me and what I'm talking about next.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I'll put all the links in the show notes so that if anybody would like to get in touch with Michelle, then you can do. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
Well, I don't know about you, but I found that interview with Michelle really interesting and insightful. I learned a lot myself about the gender pay gap and also other areas of equality in relation to pay. If you'd like more information, then I'll put all the details about how you can contact Michelle in the show notes. And of course, you can always contact me directly. It's alison@realemploymentlawadvice.co.uk. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to speaking to you again in 2 weeks' time. Thanks again for listening. Just want to finalise by saying I wouldn't be a lawyer unless I had a legal disclaimer. So I must just say to you that the information in this podcast is for information only. It's general review and a general update. It's always necessary to get specific legal advice about your circumstances. So please don't rely on anything that you've heard in this podcast. But please do feel free to contact me if you'd like further information or specific advice.